Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Menu Combat. Today's a special episode evolving from the earlier episode talking about favorite monsters. I have a special guest this week to talk about favorite job classes. This is GuhreenTi, a creator and cosplayer who plays a variety of games, has a focus on narrative-driven games and their lore and their history, both in game and development. And I got interested in GuhreenTi's content on TikTok through the Final Fantasy class. The amount of depth of knowledge that GuhreenTi provided was just so exciting. And when we were talking about the idea of good jobs, you're gonna learn more than I've ever learned. You know, everything I've learned in any like YouTube video, like we're gonna go far beyond that. And so, welcome.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And there are so many places we can start before we talk about just our personal favorite classes. I want to start with the thing that you were kind of schooling me on perspective wise. So when I used to think of job classes, I always think of like, oh, job and role, those are kind of interchangeable. Those are very similar. And I remember you're like, not really. So I'd love for you to like provide a lot of the perspective that you're sharing with me about like the distinction between job and role, because I always overlap those things.
Yeah, of course. So role versus class, they seem like the same thing, but they're not inherently the same thing. However, like I said before, they go hand in hand with each other. So starting with like class, right? Class or jobs. We know jobs as like a Final Fantasy term, but classes as a whole. So when you think of a certain class, like the first thing you kind of think of is like the equipment. It's because, we have these visuals that we have of certain things. For example, like an archer, of course, you're thinking of a bow and arrow. If you're thinking of a thief, you're thinking of like daggers and stuff like that. But that's not quite how it goes. Your job in class is actually determines the type of equipment your class can use.
Mm.
So, for example, like a bard, right? When you think of a bard, you're thinking like they're going to be equipping a musical instrument. However, a bard can equip a bow and arrow. They can equip short swords. They can equip anything like in that realm, because they're not limited to XYZ. They are allowed, because of their class, they can determine the type of equipment they can use. So, like a thief, right? One of my favorite classes. The class would primarily use like lightweight armor, equips multiple weapon types, daggers, crossbows, short swords, but these equipments aren't like inherently exclusive to the thief class, right? So that means other classes can equip them as well. But the abilities and skills is what actually makes a
Mm.
thief. Like for Final Fantasy example is like the really easy one. Thief class being one of the first few classes introduced in the system. The most defining skill set of the thief is steal and mug. They're always learned by the thief very over time. Locke, for example, Final Fantasy 6, no steal, even though he's not technically like
Right.
classed as a thief, but because he's a thief because he has those abilities. Same thing with Riku in Final Fantasy 10. She doesn't seem like a thief class, but she's actually a thief class because those are her abilities. So it's usually a role defining trait.
Mm. And the other thing you highlighted to me was also thinking about role as how it fits into the game. Like a game can have different roles. I mean, jobs can fit around that and support
Yes.
the categories. The
Yeah, so if a game doesn't have inherent classes, they're usually the abilities are going to give them the role in the game. So like if you have a party-based system, for like example in Xenoblade Chronicles, in Xenoblade Chronicles 1 specifically, we're going to use that as an example. They don't have clear cut job classes.
right.
However, for example, we have like Ryan and like Ricky, their stats and their abilities to take aggro and stuff like that makes them a tank. For example, Charla, even though she has like an actual like gun medic thing, the fact that she does buffs, debuffs, and healing makes her a support role.
Mm,
And then the same thing with like Shulk. Shulk's mostly doing like your big damage dealer, right?
right.
Your big damage dealer, so he's your DPS. And so that's how that works in just like a RPG setting, but even in MOBA settings, like things like League of Legends or Smite or like things like that, depending on who you play, will determine where you're placed on the map and your role on the map. So that's just what makes them different is the fact that you have your class, which is what your abilities, like what you're doing, like you as a character, but then your role in the overarching
Well,
thing.
I think that's such a great, eloquent way. And I know you haven't played Xenoblade 3, but generally the way that they break up their class system is that they have classes under those three roles. So those three
Yes.
roles now have all like
Yeah.
different
So
ways of playing them.
so the simple way to put it is definitely like imagine your role as your umbrella term and
Yes.
all your classes are defined underneath it.
Yes, that is perfect. And so that was a great distinction that you've brought me through. One of the things I was very curious about for you was when you see a job or a class, what are just the immediate things that like endear you to them at first?
So I think that when I look for a class that I want to play, my I always look at their abilities and what they're going to be doing, right? So I play a lot of 14. My main roles are both a support white mage and a DPS dancer.
Okay.
uh the reason I chose those abilities, so I usually play support in most games that I play regardless of like what it is. But I like having the really important job of like keeping people alive,
Mm,
making sure like we're buffs, debuffs, healing at all times. Like I feel like that's a very important role. So I like to have that role because it if you don't have a good support in your
right.
party, my hands are in the air. I'll see
It's
you
not
guys back
pretty.
at I'll see you guys back at start.
It's not a
But
pretty sight without one.
yeah, it's not a pretty sight. But for example, like what drew me to dancers, what I like is dancers have a lot of movement. I'm not a very caster person, so I wouldn't play something like a black mage and stuff like that. However, a dancer, a lot of movement, a lot of DPS. And so the fact that I have a lot of movement and a lot of freedom to move while also outputting a lot of damage makes my class very very fun for me.
Okay.
And a lot of these speed classes can also include things like rogue classes, so thief classes, um even archer classes can also have like that type of speed. So I like speed classes as a whole.
Oh,
So
okay.
if I have a lot of movement in my class and a lot of speed to my class, that's usually what I draw to. But if I need to support, I also would like a good support. And therefore I will choose classes like, the white mage, um, or even the red mage, even though the red mage is considered a DPS class, it does have support abilities. But because it doesn't do enough support, it's not considered a support class.
But just because it has the abilities, that still attracts you to being able to use that.
Yeah, so I can still output damage and have like a good time, but I can also, if need be, like I can output healing, but I'll never out heal a healer.
Right,
I'm
right,
just there as a sub support basically, but
right,
I'm still a DPS class because I mostly do DPS.
right. Okay. How about for like in non-MMO settings, like are there particular, I guess maybe what I'm thinking about is like, are there visual elements of classes that often intrigue you where you're like, I don't normally wouldn't try that class on one of my characters, but I like how they designed or how that's brought forward, and that makes it me interested to figure out how it works.
I think visuals in a class can vary because some don't have like it's like these
Yeah.
very extravagant visuals. However, I do like a very unique class. So we've gotten a lot of unique classes over time, and we also have some just like even substandard like unique classes. Like for example, another one of my really big favorites is the blue mage, right? The blue mage I think is one of the most like crazy unique classes because it's not based on just your abilities. It's the abilities you can learn from your enemies. So you're using
Yes.
enemy abilities. And the evolution of the blue mage over time has been really crazy because you had things like Tentu, right? It's not the traditional blue mage, it's called a gun mage.
Oh,
It's called a gun mage, and it's a beautiful design. I won't lie, it's a beautiful design.
okay.
But the abilities is the fact that you're not only just a gun mage, but you also have blue magic. So
Yeah.
you can also have enemy bullets, which is
Oh,
like
oh,
the crazy. Yeah, enemy bullets is crazy. So your bullets are infused with fiend enemies. But
oh,
however, you don't just use blue magic, so you're not inherently just a blue mage.
that's really clever take on that.
Yeah, so it's really cool. And then like another favorite one of my favorite characters, it's a unique way that they did his his character and like how his abilities work. So he's inherent Final Fantasy 6 Gao. You meet him in the first half of the game, and he inherently has blue mage abilities because of course he can learn enemy abilities by sending him into the belt, and then he'll come back to your party once your next encounter. However, his ability to learn Fiend's ability only is usable in the belt, so in this very small
Oh,
specific area. So if you don't level him up and you don't like grind out that area, his use as a blue mage is almost useless.
oh wow.
Yeah, but he is also can be one of the best
That's
characters, just specifically because of the specific abilities that the enemies has, and you can
right.
use in battle. So it goes really crazy.
That sounds really cool. The thing I'm doing in Xenoblade 3, they call it a soul hacker instead of a blue maid, so it's actually
Mm,
that you dress in red. It's actually kind of funny. And it's the most versatile thing in the game because you can play it as a support, attacker, or a healer
mhm.
based on the monster skills that you've learned and the monster arts. And so it's like
Oh.
you what I think Xenoblade 3 has like 100 and odd unique monsters, and so you have 100 and odd arts and skills you can learn, and so you can change the style of play based on all what you've collected. And so it's like it's the most compared to every other class, there's a kind of a system you follow through. This is
Mm.
entirely like I want to play an attack version of this blue mage. I want to play a healer version. Like, is really interesting.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I look forward to playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I haven't played it yet, but I do know that it's the first in the series to introduce actual like classes and job systems.
Yeah.
And it also kind of reminds me of the way we have like the class and job systems like in a lot of the more not I'm not gonna call them traditional Final Fantasy games, but like in this the traditional class style of Final Fantasy
Yes.
games. For example, tactics 12 has that system. A lot of the early games have that system as well. Like anything pre 4
Yes.
has that system. That's what it gives me. And that's what I really look forward to like delving into, because even in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, you do have your blades, right? Your blades and their arts, and like they also have like their own thing. So you can kind of build in a very specific way. You can build out Rex a specific way. But you still have like your determining like factors for
Yes.
the character themselves, not just the blades. The blades do help like advance that type of class like role set, but it's not like an inherent class.
Right. I think one of the things you make me think of is this idea of games that have an explicit class system and games where it's like implied, right? So like obviously something like FF3, FF5, 1 all have explicit like you are playing this class. But something
Mm.
like FF9 where Zidane is a thief, but he's not a thief class. Same thing with like Steiner's a knight, but it's not a knight class. And I always think so interestingly of games that like that do so much work in implying what the job is, even though there's no full system behind it.
Yes. So and so Final Fantasy is a good one to bring up as well, because it does have a lot of games that like do not have a specific class system, but their role is so set that you can like imply
You're
that they're
right.
this. Like a really popular one right now, that since everybody's talking about it, for 7, right? So if you go to like Final Fantasy 7, that one has like zero zero class system at all. However, you can like, for example, Tifa's a really good one, right? Tifa is
Right.
very hand-to-hand combat. Tifa is a monk, very much the whole hand-to-hand thing. Even if you especially in remake, it definitely like delves in a little bit more onto it, but she's definitely that class. Another one is Yuffie is very much a ninja class. Her background, her abilities, very much the ninja class. And so it's very much implied. But then you also have other games, for example, like Type Zero. I don't know if you've ever played Type Zero before. I think
Okay.
underrated game
Okay.
for sure. But they have you're able to play 12 characters altogether, and you can switch between these characters. Each of these characters have a unique ability. And so every character is actually their unique class. They have knight class, dragoon class, monk class, time mage, white mage, and it's all based on their abilities. And so you can switch between those, build your party how you want to, but it's all implied. It's not like,
Mhm.
oh, I'm choosing knight class. You're like, no, I'm choosing first, or
Ah,
I'm choosing Sice, or I'm choosing eight, and that's their names. They're named after cards. So
okay.
if I, yeah, so if like, oh, I'm choosing like, like seven's a white mage. So like essentially they definitely do a lot of support healing and things like that. So that's how they build that up. But I think another really good one that I would like to also bring up is not even in Final Fantasy. We're gonna bring up, I don't know if you're a fan, if I'm assuming you're a fan, Kingdom Hearts.
I haven't played Kingdom Hearts properly, so this is you're gonna be
Oh,
all yes. So you're gonna have to
okay. So what's really fun is that Square Enix, in designing the organization, I don't know if you're aware of the organization.
Organization 13, right?
Yeah, yes. Each one of them are actually based off a job.
Oh,
Yes. So you have things like Zaldin. Zaldin's very much a dragoon, uses the ability jump. Sora learns the ability jump as well during the boss fight. You have Luxord. Luxord is your typical gambler. Literally, it's just that you have the off chance of like either you're going to get hurt, a lot of big damage, or you're gonna mess up, and that's like the risk of a gambler as well. You have Demix, who is a bard, you know, and also his nobodies are like explicitly dancers as well. So not just their corresponding nobodies are also literally usually the names of their nobody, the class as well.
okay.
So like Demix's nobodies are actually dancers. You have Luxord nobodies are actually called gamblers, and they do all have corresponding ones, but they're actually all corresponding to their class.
That
So it's
is sick.
really cool. It's super, super, super cool. Another really good one is Marluxia. Marluxia is actually like a Reaper class. Very much the Reaper class, the big scythe, the abilities that he uses, they're all the same thing. And it keeps going. Like you do have like Larxene. Larxene's nobodies are ninjas. You have Syx, who is Berserker class and has the Berserker nobodies, the worst nobodies. I'm gonna be so real with you. I hate them so much. I've never been smacked around by a berserker more than that. And so, these classes are very defined because of their abilities.
Right.
And it's a very huge callback to Final Fantasy jobs.
That is fascinating. So I know very little about Kingdom Hearts, but I never assumed that there was a class system embedded, and that's such a fresh way. Because if I have it right, like Organization 30 are technically antagonists, so like to embed that in your full antagonist cast ensemble. That's
Yeah, so it's 13 job systems, and each one has their own corresponding nobody that like Sora faces just in the general
right.
world, but like they're all named after their job class.
That
So
is
like when you're like for example, like when you're in Pirates of the Caribbean, you have to deal with Luxord, you mostly are facing gambler nobodies. And he very much is the gambler based on just like his ability set.
that is that is so cool. I would have never. I appreciate that. That might be the most fascinating thing that I've learned today.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And what's also really cool is that before Reapers were introduced in Final Fantasy, they actually first appeared in Kingdom Hearts.
Oh
And then we
wow.
got Reapers in Final Fantasy later.
That is wow. So that's the debut.
Yeah, so that's really the debut of the class for like going into like future Final Fantasy games. Because the Reaper's not a really common class, but it was definitely introduced a little bit later, especially in 14. It was introduced, I want to say, between either Shadowbringers or Endwalker. It's one of those two.
That, okay, okay. You got me so intrigued. One thing I'll ask before we kind of start talking about some of our favorite specific classes, how do you feel about monsters as classes? I was wondering, so when you play something like Shin Megami Tensei, or if you play something like Pokemon, I'm like, those Pokemon technically can fit certain types of roles, not in the way that we've been defining it, but in a very way of like this can be a support one, this can be like there are some ways in which you think about it. Do you think I think of them as mostly different, but do you think there's an overlap in thinking in terms of designing monsters to control to fulfill a class?
I think that for Pokemon, it's a little different because you
Right.
can Pokemon, it's they don't really inherently have a
Yeah.
class, and they also don't inherently have a role as
Oh,
well.
right.
It's just they have their own weakness like triangle.
Right.
So they have more of a this is stronger against this, but this
Yes,
is
man.
weak against this, but it's never inherently like I have to only use this for
Right.
this. Like there's some Pokemon that can use certain moves to buff like
Yeah,
themselves or like
that's
I never, but it's not like in a way that it has a role because
right.
it's they could be so many things at once. They're like individual.
Yes.
However, in something like, for example, like Kingdom Hearts is another good
Yeah.
one. Like it's very set,
Hmm.
like set in stone. They can you enemies I think can have like their own classes. I don't think they really too much have a role system because they're usually the random encounters, right? But they can have a class.
That's
They definitely can have a class, I believe.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes yeah, that just came to my mind because I'm like thinking about something like Dragon Quest V where you end up having monsters a part of your own party, and I was like, are those considered class? Well, you're right. Like they're their own unique thing, separate for the most part.
Yeah, yeah, and the way you build, you know, your team is usually like based on like strength and like, you
Yes.
know, your ability sets and stuff like that. But you can also build like really funny things and not really be affected by it because there's not like a specific role you have to fill in. I could
Yeah.
be funny and be like, I want an all Caterpie thing and
Yeah.
just have like level 100 Caterpies for whatever reason and go but like I would it's not like I have to fulfill a certain role, so I
Right.
wouldn't so you don't really
Mm,
apply the role system to like
no,
Pokemon.
that makes sense. Okay. That's yeah. That feels right. I was just like, it sounded up far-fetched, but I was like wondering just for a second.
I get where you're get like you're like
Yeah.
where we were getting her because we're talking so much about like abilities and skill sets and
Yes.
stuff like that. But in something like that, it's hard to place them in a role because they're
Oh,
not fulfilling something. They're
yes.
just you're just kind of adding something to your party because you like
Right.
it and you're and it's really based on your strength and your leveling at that point. It's not really based on your skill set.
Well said. Okay, that brings the clarity. And so I'm thinking for our next part, we'll go back and forth between some of our favorite classes that we like. And
Mm-mm.
so I'll say one, and then you'll say one, and we can go back and forth. The first class that came to mind when I was like, all right, I have to talk about classes that I like was the wizard class in Bravely Second. I
Mm-mm.
used to hate this class. When I first played Bravely Second, I hated it because it's not a traditional black mage class, which I was so used to. Like Bravely Default gives you the four classic jobs in the first one. And so when I
Mm.
got this, I was like, oh, why doesn't this operate like a normal casting magic casting class? But
Mm-hmm.
instead, it modifies your magic. And so it becomes a great support class to when you have more black mage abilities, you can literally turn cast like a Faraga as a dart or as a hammer or as a needle, as a blast, or like, and so it's changing the property of your magic. And it becomes so fascinating. Like you can cast, for example, there's a moment where you can use re-raise as a mist. And what that means is that it'll be like a prolonged effect on either yourself or your enemies. When I was
Mm.
facing some zombies, I would cast re-raise on the entire set of enemies. So whenever they'd resurrect, they get killed at the end of a turn because the mist status effect is permanently laid on them through mist. And it's like the inventive ways of changing how the magic works is what I was like, oh, Bravely Second is challenging me to use these skills and tools in ways I hadn't considered. You can, for example, another example is where you can use Kneel to make sure that your magic goes at the beginning of each turn. So it'll be a weaker version of fire, but if you know something's weak to fire, even though it's weaker, you can guarantee it to start the turn. Like small things like that, where you're like, oh, I'm not just thinking about magic in the classic ways that I've been trained by like Final Fantasy Tactics Advance or Tactics. I'm now thinking about it as how do I modify the skill set? How do I change my use of black magic in new ways? And
Mm-hmm.
It was exciting. It is probably one of the moments where I'm like, the more and more I became more familiar of how to use a wizard class, I loved carrying over those abilities over to other classes because that was key. The element is that you can carry what the ability is called spellcraft. So you'd if you switch over to a black magician and
Mhm.
equip the spellcraft skill, so you could craft all these new possibilities of the magic that you have, and that works for a time mate. Like it was great. So that's one of my favorite classes.
Mhm, mhm. It sounds really good. I haven't played Bravely Second. I used to play a lot of Bravely Default. So because it was so close, like it was so
Yes.
adjacent to Final Fantasy that it is they definitely evolved a lot of the class systems over time. So
Yeah.
like just like how you're able to expand use your abilities, like beyond just being the basic casting black mage, being
Yeah.
able to use other like elements alongside that definitely makes it more unique and more exciting.
Yes. That it's the thing that I love about that series where it's like that was I love how they played around with all those elements throughout.
Mhm. They definitely they definitely really expanded upon a lot of the like basic classes. And
Yeah.
that's what makes like games like Bravely Default like really unique and makes it even like more of it allows you to strategize more
Yes.
as
Yeah.
well. And I love a game that will have you also strategizing. It's just chef's kiss.
Yes. Yes. What about for you? What are one of your favorite classes?
Aside from the two that I talked about
Yes.
before, I also am a really big fan of the summoner class. The summoner
Uh-huh.
job I think is like one of the it's not a super like it's not a common in every game type of class, but it's especially in games like Final Fantasy 4, Final Fantasy 9 and Final Fantasy like 10, they were very much prominent. Especially 10. I think I'm gonna use 10 and 4 probably as my big bases because those are like the big games that I was like, wow, I really like this class. Um, I had an introduction for myself to the summoner class from Yuna from Final Fantasy 10. And what made her class really fun, she's also a combination white mage summoner.
Yes.
But the thing is the fact that you're you can't just summon things, you have to collect your summons
Yes.
and you have to go out of your way to collect summons. So for example, we had really unique summon designs outside of the normal ones that could be summoned throughout the games, like, Ramu, um we had, Ifrit, etc. But we also had like unique summons. Like we got Yojimbo, which is a really
Yes.
good one. We had Shion, which also kind of looks like Odin. We had the Magus sisters, which are really cool too as well. And even we got early summons. For example, we also had like Kate Sith before 7 was a summon. So we had things like that. And in 4 especially, like Rydia, she doesn't really start off with like all these summons. Like you literally have to go out of your way
Yeah.
through trials to get summons like Leviathan, Bahamut, and things like that. And that's like just that journey to building yourself up
Okay.
as a summoner like makes like the journey even more exciting because then you have a whole new ability, a whole new skill set, a whole new way, almost even similarly to Pokemon,
Yeah.
like these summons also have their own weaknesses and stuff like that. So you have to really plan out how you're going to use and maximize like your summon for like the betterment. And so I thought that was like really cool. And the fact that, summons change over time. Like we still have our like our really big, like the big ones, like of course Ifrit, Shiva, Bahamut, like our big notable ones, but we've got like summons like Filet for and stuff like that. So, that's what really makes like that clash like so fun because like it's just the evolution of the class, but the journey of the class as well.
I, you get at such a good element where it's like part of what makes jobs interesting is like the extra work sometimes you have to do to make it become what makes it special. Like
Yeah.
that, yeah, that you got me thinking, side note of Golden Suns, where you equip Jin to gain certain classes and you can literally summon things based on the Jin you've collected. but that de-equips it from you, which changes your class. Like, yeah, you got me thinking about like even something like that where the collection system affects your summons and the
Mhm.
collection system affects your job that you have available.
Yeah, and there's also like there's other classes as well, or just even like game sets. Like
Yeah.
10 2, I think is probably like one of the ways. If you're not using a class, or even two also kind of has that leveling system. You're not using something,
Yeah.
you're not going to advance that.
Yes.
You actually have to journey with each class. You have to journey with each ability. And that's what I really like. I really draw myself to the summoner, because the summoner, in almost any sense, like if you're trying to gain a summon, you got to go through a journey. Like it is always a pilgrimage from point A to point B in order to become the better summoner. Otherwise, your summons don't do anything for you if you're not going to be willing to take that journey.
Yeah. Oh man. You got me remembering the journey that I had to take in five to go find some of the hidden summoners and summons in that as well.
And then like the different summons that you like gain from just the crystals themselves are just like that whole thing is just it's so rewarding. And I think that's also another thing that's really fun about the class, is that the summoner class being what it is and being so limited, it's rewarding because if you do get these more rare and more stronger summons from like your trials, you reap the benefits because now you're so much more stronger than you were in the beginning of the game, where you're like, hee hee, I have one summon, but now you're like, hee hee, I have an arsenal that I can mix and match to fit my needs. And it's only because I had hard work.
Yeah. That, yeah, that's excellent. You got me one of the other jobs I wanted to bring up that I love because it's also a great way to talk about this series is the maid class in Fire Emblem Birthright. And
Mm,
I the maid class is an upgrade from the Troubadour. Whenever I play Fire Emblem before Birthright, I was never really good at the Troubadour healing class,
mm,
but I use it to mend what. But what I've always liked about the maid class is that because they get the elements from the ninjas and pair that with healing, now they're able to do some damage, but they have now a nice debuff element, made the pairing system in Fire and Birthright so great, where it's like now they can complement people both in terms of attack, buff, and if I need to heal, they can do all of that. It was such a it's one of my favorite classes are in Fire Emblem overall, like just out of like the use of that you get out of it.
yeah, and it's really cool. I think Fire Emblem does introduce a lot
Yeah.
over time. We talked a little bit before we started about the Troubadour class and how it initially was a D&D class. And then in the D&D class, a Troubadour was a variation of the Bard. High charisma, high dexterity, high constitution. So when you play games like Fire Emblem, the Fate series, and also as well as like Xenoblade, because Xenoblade also has a Troubadour class. They're healer classes, so the evolution from being like a Bard class to a more clerical class is actually just so intriguing to me.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder where they'll take these going forward, right? Like maybe we're here in another 5 years and we're now seeing a different version of a troubadour again. Because I think one of the things that it was one of the first questions I asked you is whether or not you had a lot of history with D&D, because I think a lot of this class system is coming from that perspective. But I think the further and further we get from those origins, the ways that we will remix them and reconceptualize them
Mhm.
will be so fascinating to see. Like maybe we'll have things that we hadn't even considered yet.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that just in Fire Emblem alone, like the Troubadour has evolved so much, because initially the Troubadour was introduced in 1996 in the Japanese only release of Fire Emblem: The Genealogy of the Holy War. Um, and they also appeared in Thracia 776 as well. However, going forward, they wouldn't really be as much of a healer role, because they end up starting to be replaced with actual clerics and actual priests and things like that. But their class changes. The maid wasn't introduced until the Fate series, right? But before that, when you upgrade the Troubadour, they were paladins, they were Valkyries, they were, they were so many things all at once. So seeing just this one thing evolve over time, and then now you have the maid class, right? The maid, the butler, since they're interchangeable depending on your uh your gender. Um, you you have them intermixing even more classes because they're now not just a clerical class, but they're also like a ninja class. And so
Right.
their abilities change. And so now you have a more unique class set with that takes so many different parts of classes and like melds them together, which is why I like games like Fire Emblem and like Bravely Default, or even games like Dragon Quest. Also, like you can mix and match like your
Yes.
classes to really create something new.
No, that
And so I'm really curious on how like future games will keep evolving like the mixing of classes as well.
yes. And I always think with games like this, one of the critiques that you often get is that they're because it becomes so systems based, folks get very overwhelmed by the options.
Mm.
And so I do wonder as they give us more and more permutations, how do you find ways to folks to easily understand what these new classes are?
I think I think if you overcomplicate a class, it gets a little too overwhelming. I think if you take a class, even if you bring have a unique class, if you give them a very select skill set and a way to evolutionize like throughout the game, like
Okay.
just grow your skills over time, I think it'll be easier for people to kind of understand like their roles in the game as
Mm,
well. Because if you just have a bunch of classes and you don't know your role, you're not going to advance like
right.
very far, especially at least in party based game systems,
Yeah.
right? But if you understand your role and you understand your abilities, you're able to perform better in your role.
Yes. That
So I think you have when having clarity in your classes makes for you to have a better game.
yes. I think that's the hardest part of these kind of games to like streamline it to make it clear and make it effective for growth. The Was there another class you wanted to highlight? And if not, I have another question I was going to ask to kind of close us out in this discussion.
I do want to talk about one specific class. It is a
Yes.
very, very, very unique class because it only appears in one game.
Okay, okay.
And it appears in the international version and HD remaster of Final Fantasy X-2, and that is something called the Festivalist class.
Okay, okay.
So the Festivalist class is very much it kind of sounds like what it looks like. They're festival goers, but the thing is though is that their ability sets are pretty unique because they do damage. They very much do DPS damage. However, they also have the ability to kind of have support as well for themselves. So they are able to cast abilities, things like regen, having like proofs, so like slow proof, stop proof, walls, things like that, but also having like unique abilities and also as well as unique animations
Yes.
that help them do like crazy damage. And they don't appear in any other Final Fantasy game. It's very much strictly to Final Fantasy X-2. However, I do think that it is one of the most unique and really fun classes because it's a class that's also very usable.
Mm,
So it's not like a throwaway
yeah,
class.
right, right. Like really effective in its. Okay.
Yeah. So, like, for example, when you get the class initially, right, and you use it, you're like, this class seems silly because they're dressed in like little, like, almost like traditional, like Japanese, like festival wear. You have some like Yuna's in a kimono, you
Mm.
have some, like Pains in like traditional garb, has like the mask. And they'll also have like traditional little things that are usually found at festivals. So, like giant fans, or like sometimes the goldfish from like the games that you play and so on and so forth, and they use that in battle.
Oh,
So their abilities are also actually more based on like their what they're equipped with, but they're not actual equipment.
okay.
It's just literally within the design. And so I think it's a really cool and unique class that they introduced because it's not a useless class either. It does a lot of you can a lot of guard, a lot of support, as well as a lot of DPS. And I think that the fact that it's limited to just one game is a shame.
Mhm. Now, you talked. you brought up something when you're highlighting how Yuna wears the garb and how Pain wears the garb. That's the other thing that we don't mention a lot with job classes is that, ironically, those are the games in which that the main characters demonstrate their personality in the different ways that they wear a jobs element. And so, like, when I was playing five, when I was like, oh, Galuf wears it in this way, or Bartz wears it in this way, or even in Bravely
Mm.
Default, where I'm like, oh, Idia will wear it in this way, and Ring a Bell. It's just such a nice way where you're like, you know what the standard is, but everybody's wearing this outfit to kind of represent their personality. And I think that's one of the underrated elements of what job classes allow you to do. You get to see new versions of whoever your favorite party member is and see how they
Mm.
express themselves with it.
Oh yes, and I think that's one thing that really, really, really like drew me to the dress sphere system in 10.2 is because every single class they do not look the same, but they have their own elements that you're like, wow, this is actually like it feels like what they would wear as their individual characters. So their personality definitely shines through that the outfits. And I think that it's probably in the most unique way that it's done in just this one game compared to all the other games. Like you do have like the sprite ones where they put everybody in their respective suits and stuff like that. So you do see like the little minor differences in the sprites. But when you want to go like up close and personal with like how like extremely detailed that they put into these costumes, like each person looks different and vastly different, but it's according to their character. And that's what really makes like the designs very unique and very fun.
You might have single-handedly made Final Fantasy X-2 go up my Final Fantasy playlist quite a lot.
I'm so excited. If you played 10, I think 10.2 is the perfect after years game. And I say after years, this is very much like a little bit off topic, but the game is not meant to be a new adventure. The game is meant to follow a story. So very much like Clan Ad after years, it's that.
Okay, okay. So it's a nice epilogue.
It's very much a nice epilogue with some drama.
All right. You got, as I said, I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to play 10-2, but I think the things that you highlighted fall in line with all the things I've described that I just love here. So
Oh
I'm
yeah,
quite
and like
excited.
I think that the combat system and the class system just alone make the game worth playing because you will have so much fun because you can build your party however you want, and you also have spear grids which will also give you um buffs, advantages,
Right.
and even like ability buffs as well based on like the classes that you put on there. So
Okay.
it makes building a party really fun. And then you can also assign like it also helps you assign your roles as well because you can like add roles to your party, but you also don't you're not limited as well
Mm,
because so you can really build like if you wanted a pure DPS class, build pure DPS, but like if you want a very balanced class, like the classes do fall under an umbrella role. So like if you're going to use a white mage, if you're going to use like a songstress and stuff like that, they're going to be your supporting roles. And if you want to have support in your party, but then you want to have something like a high damage tank, you're going to build like you're going to bring a dark knight and you can like dual dark knight with like one support and you'll be fine.
this is all speaking very much to my heart. Okay. You got me.
So if you really like if you so I think that if you really want something that like has a lot of buildable character, like just outside of the story, outside of the characters, outside of anything else, like just the combat alone and how you're able to build and customize your party, it's definitely like it's definitely going to be just that. And the way you build your party as well over time is that depending on how often you're using these classes will depend on the new abilities they learn and how the class itself grows and its usefulness later down the line. So if you're not building it up but you're trying to use it late game, you're not going to really
Gonna
get
get
like the maximum like
right.
use out of it. But if you're constantly like changing and using them over time and like gaining all these abilities and late game you can really build like however you want to, or you can build silly.
That
And
that's
in the
a
same way that a summoner works, you can also get optional
oh,
classes as well. So you can do certain missions that'll give you optional classes. Things like, for example, like Lady Luck is their version of the Gambler, which isn't found in very many games. Um, but you could get something like that as long as you know you do specific side missions for it. Otherwise, you can go through the whole game not having certain classes ever.
wow. Okay. Okay. Oof. I'm gonna So two things. I'm gonna make one more mention. I'm gonna mention the game. I'm not gonna go fully into the class of the game, but I'd feel remiss not to mention it. I love Final
Mm,
Fantasy Tactics Advance. That's like one of my favorite games ever. I love the class system, and I just want to highlight the ninja ability. It takes 999 AP to get, but it gives you double sword, which means that once you get that, taking that to any other class is such a fun thing to do. I just have to mention
mm,
that there's a lot of other great classes in that game, but you're talking about just an ability that I love. That I was like, if I want to be OP, that I make sure I go out of my way to get that. Uh, but I wanted to know if there's anything you want to say as about classes and jobs that you don't think that we've covered yet before we fully wrap up.
um, I think that just understanding the difference between them all. Um, I didn't mention it. I talked briefly about this, but like it's your abilities do matter when you're classing yourself as a build. And if it's especially if it's very not specified. Like a good example is Skyrim, right? Skyrim, you can build your character however you want to, but if you're trying to build a specific type of class, you're going to focus on these specific abilities. And like I think a lot of people, my favorite thing to build in Skyrim is the thief, right? But when you're building a thief, if you're not building things like your sneak, like your speech, pickpocketing, lock picking, things like that, you're not going to achieve thief class.
Hmm.
And so it's not really like a role because you don't really have a role in Skyrim. You're yourself. You're doing what you want to do. But if you want to build a specific type of character, like if you want to build a mage, you're going to focus on mage abilities. If you're building a thief, if you're going to focus on thief ability, if you're going to focus on, anything else, you want to make sure that you acquire these abilities to make that class.
That
And so once you understand like your difference between your class and your role, it makes building your characters and playing and putting parties together and stuff like that like a ton easier. And that crosses all kinds of game, whether it be tabletop, whether it be RPGs, whether it be like online games, MOBAs, etc. Like once you know what you are, it makes your class a lot easier, or it makes your role a lot easier as well. Even if in role-less games, if you
yes.
understand your abilities, you understand your role.
I think that is the perfect way to kind of wrap up the heart of this. So first, just thank you again, Green Tea, for showing up today. This was, as I said, I learned a lot, and I know that my listeners learned a lot from you. If they wanted to find you, follow you, where would you want them to go? What should they follow?
You can find me as GuhreenTi, GuhreenTi, on Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. It's Green Tea TV. I do all of my lore dumps, collection show offs, things like that. So if you want to learn more about the history of games and their development, you can always find it there.
Yes, please follow Green Tea. So much to learn, so much to enjoy. And if you want to follow the Wolves Den 25 on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you want to just follow the podcast at Menu Combat on Instagram and Twitter. And thank you for listening to Menu Combat, the podcast where you pause and customize your party. I think that there's never been an episode where that's more appropriate as a title. And thank you for listening.